Hello and welcome to a special show around Budget 2018-19. I am Pranjal Sharma. Joining me now for a conversation is Dr. Bibek Debroy, who is the Chairman of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Dr. Debroy, thank you for being with us. A lot of excitement and, of course, anger around the budget which was announced by Finance Minister Arun Jaitley. In some ways, it appears that the effort in this last budget of the NDA government is to bridge the rural-urban divide and the effort to ensure that one part of India does not get left behind. How would you interpret it?
Well, I only partly agree with you, and I'll tell you why I said I only partly agree with you. Quite often, commentaries on the budget tend to look at the budget only in isolation. But this budget, the budget is only one instrument that's available with the union government. And there are several initiatives that this government has been taking since the year 2014. And this budget needs to be considered against the backdrop of that because that's the broader canvas. And this budget merely builds on those initiatives. I agree with you insofar as the responsibility of the government is to ensure that no particular part of the country, no geographical area, be it the 115 aspirational districts, be it rural, is left out. The reason I said I partly disagree with you is you take something like the ENAM, the National Agriculture. It happened before the budget. So everything that is being done in the budget needs to be looked at as an element of continuity in the process, not something that suddenly sprung from the blue today.
That's an important point because this is, I think, something which the government has been emphasizing, that these are effectively an extension of a policy, and budget statement, apart from the accounts of the government, is really a statement of intent of policies. And that continuity has a new dimension in this set of intentions and statements, which seems to be more focused on rural infrastructure.
All right, so let me step back a bit and ask that what should a government be doing? A government should be doing several things, but certainly what a government should be doing is for individuals, I will come to enterprises later, for individuals providing a certain minimum set of public goods and services. Now, that may be LPG gas, pre-budget, that may be electricity, pre-budget, that may be telephone connectivity, pre-budget, and that may be health insurance, which many people are interpreted as a budget initiative. But all I'm saying is that initiative had already existed. All that the budget did was to extend it. APMC, those are the mandis. Now that had already been done. A natural extension of that is to take it to the 22,000 hearts that are not mandis. So that's the reason I'm stressing this point, that several things that the budget has done, the extensions of what the government had already done. The PPF contribution, it had already been done, is now being extended.
So in that sense, budget becomes a milestone of sorts where you assess what has been achieved and then take forward whatever is working.
That also, and of course, because some of that requires public resources and a union government's funds are constrained because of the 14th Finance Commission, because of the centrally sponsored schemes, because of revenue compensation given to states on account of GST, because of the uncertainty on account of GST revenues, and you want to do this without abandoning the path of fiscal consolidation. That's where the budget becomes important, that the financing it, as you yourself said, the budget is nothing but an annual statement of the union government's receipts and expenditure. So how to manage the financing part of it without giving up on the goal of fiscal consolidation?
Here, as your role as well, Dr. Debroy, of being in charge of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, how do you see the outlook now for 2018-19, not just because of the last year of the government, but with the hope that After the various changes and fundamental transformations which have happened, specifically GST, the new year seems to be full of uncertainties. There are several assessments on where it could go, but how do you see the economic change rolling out in the next few months?
We are moving away a bit from the budget. Now the budget, of course, the budget numbers are based really on the nominal GDP growth rate, but we are now moving on to the realm of the real GDP growth rate. The Economic Survey and the Finance Minister, both of them have said that in 18-19 they expect the real rate of GDP growth to be between 7 to 7.5%. My optimism suggests that 7 to 7.5% is fine, but it's likely to be towards 7.5% rather than 7%. If one looks at the drivers for growth, the drivers for growth can only be four. They can be government expenditure, they can be private consumption, there can be private investment, or there can be net exports. These are the four drivers of growth. Public expenditure has already been happening, constrained of course by what I said about fiscal consolidation needs. But the public expenditure has been happening in roads, has been happening in railways, it will happen in airports, it will happen through the Bharatmala project, but there are limits to what public expenditure can do. There are signs and some indicators, not very robust, but that will come, suggesting that private investments are beginning to inch up a little bit. Although one should remember two qualifications. One is there is still excess capacity in some sectors.
Correct.
And two, there is the broader problem of the banks. Having said that, there are some signs that private investment is picking up. There are some signs that net exports are also beginning to pick up, although that again becomes a function of what happens to the exchange rates. Therefore, I am inclined to think that because these two drivers of growth and consumption also, by the way, some sectors there are signs, because these three drivers of growth are beginning to kick in, we are not going to get spectacular rates of growth, spectacular being defined as 8.5% plus, but certainly I am inclined to think that we are talking about 7.5%.
So would you say that the turnaround of the economy, as it were, is now on a firmer track and it's likely to continue to grow and you don't see that faltering?
GST will always have an element of uncertainty for the very simple reason that GST implementation is not something that happens overnight. There will be transition pains.
So the impact will continue to be felt for a couple of years at least?
It will continue to be felt. There is no other country in the world which has quite implemented a GST like this, which is federal in nature. Most other countries which have GSTs, with the exception of Canada, they are unitary GSTs. And so far as GST is concerned, what one is saying is that the shorter term consequences in terms of the transition pains are more than offset by the long term gains in terms of GDP growth. But all said and done, I think 7.5% is more or less very, very plausible in 2018-19.
So is this a firm track for growth? Do you see any turbulence ahead, or do you think that even though it may be a slow climb back to a level of maybe 8%, but it will stay steady?
Well, turbulence, meaning one could hypothetically argue that crude oil prices might shoot up to such high levels that there would be a serious impact on growth. But whatever projections I've seen does not suggest that crude oil prices are going to go up to those dizzying heights. So if it is 7.5% or thereabouts, I don't really see any reason to think there are any sort of what people normally use the expression downside risks. I don't really see any downside risks. Many of the things the government has done in the budget and even before the budget lead to payoffs in the slightly longer run. Whether it is through the hearts now, whether it is through the airports, the transport connectivity, all of this. So all of these lead to productivity gains. Even GST leads to productivity gains. So therefore, gradually, the growth rate is only going to get better. But going up to 8.5%, that's conditional on a whole lot of things. How the world economy is going to recover, and also, as I said earlier, the exchange rate.
So here, you talked about the four drivers of change, which is government and private investment plus private consumption and exports. Here, before I come to the thoughts that you shared on, there's some positive signs of private investment picking up. Consumer sentiment is ultimately going to drive growth. Consumer confidence is to drive growth and demand, which will perhaps have a very important effect on capacity addition and fresh investments. How do you assess consumer confidence and sentiment right now?
The answer depends a little bit on whether you are linking it to the immediate aftermath of the budget or independent of the budget. Because the immediate aftermath of the budget is such that whether it is the Sensex or whether it is broadly sentiments, they tend to be very myopic and react for extremely short-term reasons. They would have reacted completely differently had for some reason the personal income tax rate been reduced to 25%. So I will not attach too much of importance to sentiments as driven by the budget. Right. If you move away from that, if you look at whatever indicators are floating around on sales of FMCG, on auto ancillaries, all of these tend to suggest that consumer expenditure is beginning to happen. Although I would just attach one question mark to that, that demonetization and the subsequent cleansing up has dampened some consumer expenditure where the source of that income was somewhat questionable. So if one is not talking about that, if one is talking about legitimate consumption expenditure, I think there are several data points which tend to suggest that consumer sentiments are beginning to inch up.
Is there a government role in improving consumer confidence and encouraging them to spend more?
A government role? No, look. Question is, a government has limited resources. What do you expect the government to do with those resources? I can reduce the personal income tax rate. I can slash indirect taxes. But simultaneously, I cannot give you the railways and the national highways. The trouble with this elusive consumer sentiment is, as a consumer, I don't want to pay the taxes, but I visit the so-called developed countries and I want that infrastructure which is like that in those countries. You can't have both of those together. So therefore, if you expect the better railway stations, if you expect better airports, if you expect better roads, better trains, then I need to be prepared to pay for that.
Fair point. However, one of the elements that informs consumer confidence and their willingness to spend money is employment, or the perception that my job is secure, especially for the tax-paying class, or even for entrepreneurs. And in the future, I either expect a rise in my income or at least stability in my income.
Right.
Employment, therefore, has a very important influence on this. Is that improving also? I know that the debate around the EPFO figures and fresh registrations has two different sets of interpretations, but what is your interpretation?
Well, first, let's get the salaried out of the way first. What is the salaried reaction to the budget? Oh, taxes have not come down. I don't want to repeat what I already said, but now there's going to be electronic assessment. Not just for the salaried, but for everyone. That's if I have been complaining about harassment by tax inspectors, then this is something very major. Earlier, I had to give bills for transport. I had to give bills for medical. Instead of that, if I now have a standard deduction, that's a good thing. So I should be, as a salaried individual, I should be applauding that. If I move away from salaried, I don't want to get into the debate, but the broad point is very simple, that we don't have any solid data on jobs and employment after 2011-12. After that, there has been no national sample survey round. The next one is going to be towards the end of 2018. The data will be towards the end of 2018. Having said that, employment, the broad thrust of the government is to persuade people to also become entrepreneurs. So one should look at the various initiatives in the budget, outside the budget, in terms of driving entrepreneurship, including in the rural sector. But one of the significant factors I would mention is, again, here I am citing this as an example of something that had been tried on a pilot basis earlier and now has been extended in the budget. Two things. One is the government contribution to the PF, and the second is fixed term contracts. Both of those, I think, are extremely important in terms of stimulating employment growth, apart from what I said broadly about entrepreneurship and productivity.
So I think this fixed term growth, the fixed term employment is something which has been universally welcomed. I've spoken to industry leaders and they think that this is going to be fantastic, especially in sectors like textile where there's so much of cyclical behavior. With this fixed term employment and such indicators, it appears that employment will be fairly stable. If I come back to the point of investment, therefore, when do you see the investment cycle changing gears? When do you see this capacity addition happening while we are at 75 to 80%? When do you see the tipping point?
I think, Pranjal, this question is a little bit difficult to answer because it varies widely from sector to sector. Take the one that is invariably regarded as something that is suffering, and I'm talking to real estate. If you look at commercial real estate, not residential real estate, commercial real estate investments have begun to happen. Similarly, if I look at pharmaceuticals, if I look at some IT-related things, if I even look at garments, it's not that investments are not happening. They're beginning to happen. They're happening for steel. They're beginning to happen for other construction-related items. So therefore, it's not as if binary, no, it isn't there today, yes, it's there tomorrow. There is a broader issue of the banks and the non-performing assets. Now that one, a complete cleaning up, and this is incremental, but a complete cleaning up will probably take at least 2 years, because it's not that fresh NPAs are being added. That problem has been resolved, but there's a legacy, a stock of existing NPAs. That cleaning up will at least take 2 years.
And even though the insolvency code and the bankruptcy code is out, I think the process to use these tools to clean up will take a while.
Remember that all these things have to go through a judicial process also. That itself is time consuming.
So I think we'll have to, let it play out in the way that it will. A couple of themes that I want to just address and then we can close, which one subject close to your heart, exports, but linked to that export is also the challenge of protectionism, which the economic survey has identified as one of the possible disruptors. Where do you see exports today? And I think it's linked to both protectionism and the exchange rate.
Well, net exports have begun to, they're better than they were earlier. The export figures have been better than they are earlier. You see, the exchange rate is something that one can debate for hours altogether, because the exchange rate is a function of how price sensitive your exports are. Not just vis-a-vis the dollar, but vis-a-vis competitive currencies. And the broad issue is that from the point of view of exports of goods and even services, but more goods, you would want the exchange rate to depreciate. But the exchange rate does not depreciate because of the capital inflows which exert an upward pressure. And there are limits to how much the central bank can intervene, because whether it buys or sells, there are costs to that. It's not costless. Exports, I think some of them are not as price sensitive as they used to be compared to what India's exports used to be historically. And any exchange rate things can be nullified by productivity. Any appreciation can be nullified by productivity increases. So I am not that dismal about exports. Yes, it is contingent on, well, exports depend on three things. They depend on exchange rate, they depend on demand conditions, and depend on the supply. Several initiatives, doing business, the National Logistics Portal now, all of these are meant to improve the supply side.
So, the fear of protectionism, is that a dimension to worry about?
Well, no. Look, protectionism is something to worry about, but having worried about it, what do we do? Because protectionism is part of life. The WTO negotiations are stuck. Even within the WTO negotiations, if you have some discipline on tariffs, the protectionism will surface through other means. So it exists. There's no willing it away, but there is nothing very much you can do about it.
Finally, Dr. Debroy, you've just edited a book on transparency, on black economy and how things seem to be improving on that front. These measures, which continue to be intensified by the government as also reflected in the budget, where do you see a point where you can say that India is a much more transparent economy?
Well, again, it's not really a binary, it's a part of a process, because part of what is happening is a transition from the informal to the formal, unorganized to the organized. Many things have already become transparent. In the budget speech, there was a mention to something that the Prime Minister has mentioned earlier, which is the abolition of interviews for Group C, Group D posts. So that's become transparent already. The GEM portal for government procurement, that's already become transparent. So it's part of a process. Things are gradually becoming more and more transparent.
Is it easy to measure something like this?
Well, something like Transparency International always does it.
But that's a perception survey.
It's a perception, and these are always, if they are going to be satisfactory, they have to be perception based, whether it is Transparency International which does it or whether it's the Center for Media Studies which does it. And the moment they are perception based, they obviously have to be taken with that pinch of salt because they are perception based. But for example, you take something like CMS, Center for Media Studies, because they've been doing this over a long period of time for public services. They tend to suggest that yes, there are problems still, but over a period of time, it's becoming better.
Dr. Debroy, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. It appears very clearly that there is a strong fundamental turnaround which is being set into place, and we now have to wait for the results to show. Thank you so much.